That train donned what appeared to be a gas mask. He then took a canister out of his bag and opened it. The train at that time began to fill with smoke. He then opened fire, striking multiple people on the subway and in the platform.
Rush Hour Bloodshed. The horrifying and bone-chilling screams were as loud as the firecracker-like sounds that came out of a terrorist's weapon on the subways in Brooklyn, New York. We are following the breaking news from Brooklyn, where multiple people were shot in the New York City subway system during Tuesday morning rush hour. According to police, at least 16 people were injured. It's not immediately clear how many of the injured were shot. The incident, reported just before 8:30 a.m. local time, appears to have started on a northbound N train in Brooklyn. The 36th Street subway station in Sunset Park and the 25th Street station in Greenwood Heights were also impacted. A man who works in a bodega outside the subway told a local news station about 10 to 15 people ran to his store for safety. He said, "I didn't know what happened until they said there was a guy shooting. It was horrifying. People were just terrified. I saw 3 or 4 people with gunshot wounds to their legs. They just fell to the floor before the cops came. They just stayed here for a couple of minutes before the coast was clear." Everyone was terrified. I was terrified. The New York City Police Department said there are no active explosive devices at this moment, but police said there was smoke on the N train prior to it pulling into the 36th Street station. Obviously, there was also video. Multiple people said smoke devices were likely used. Authorities are still searching, and they have identified, as of this morning, the suspect, who was wearing a reflective vest, a gas mask. Investigators believe this was a coordinated attack, but a motive still remains unclear. We discussed that, the trauma, how victims and witnesses might recover from the trauma, and more this morning with our special guest this morning. Obviously, the incident is really disconcerting, and as you might know, I mean, that's an understatement, that is disconcerting. But the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and authorities in Massachusetts and Washington are saying that they are also monitoring the situation. President Biden has been briefed. What's the latest? Well, this is one of those situations where the victims, their families, and all those people we saw running for their lives in video and in real time will never forget. How does one get through such trauma? What's needed to cope? We speak with Jesston, the executive director of Changelic, an organization geared toward helping people move on from traumatic experiences, and Dr. Joanne Frederick, a DC-based licensed mental health counselor and author of the book Copeology, and of course, James Wright of the Washington Informer. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hey, good morning.
Good to have you. Let's start, ladies first, of course. Dr. Fredericks, tragedy like this certainly results in a lot of trauma. What is the first thing, and obviously you're not treating any of the folks involved yesterday, but what is the first thing, if perhaps one of them come to you, what's the first thing you say to them?
The first thing I say is, the first thing I do is listen. So just listen to their experience from their perspective, right? Because multiple people will have multiple perspective. So what is their perspective? And let them talk, let them cry, let them get it out however they need to. And then after, the things that I may say is ask them questions. How do they feel? What would they like to do? What would they like to see happen? Trauma is a process, right? Or let me say recovery is a process. But trauma happens to the person that was there, the people who witnessed it, even the people who's constantly watching and hearing this over the news, over the television. And so it's definitely a process, definitely traumatic incident for many people.
And Jesston Williams of Changelic, we know that this is one of the things that you guys specialize in, right? That coping with trauma, that after effects of trauma. What happens at this point? I mean, I was saying before we went on the air, I'm in New York. I'm from New York and have taken the subway many a times. I don't live in New York at the moment, but it's a trigger. I can't imagine getting on the subway. How do I get back on the subway, Jesston?
Well, that's a great question, Stacy. It's going to take time before people are going to be able to get to the point where they will want to get back on the subway. As the doctor mentioned, the first thing that needs to be done is letting people, being able to allow people to speak, or in this position with my company Tangelic, we just want to be here to support. That's the main thing, and that support not only comes from seeking outside help, but as well as family and friends, and staying away from media for a bit, so they won't be exposed to the tragic events that took place, that they were a part of. But in regards to how do they do that? There's I believe there's no set time, no set rules. It's definitely going to have to happen when that individual is ready, and once they're provided the counseling and the support that's needed, then they can, from that point, take the necessary steps to taking that next step to travel the subway or find other modes or means of transportation.
Yeah, and Dr. Frederick, before I go to James, I want to come back to you, Dr. Frederick. So you say you listen first, and we heard what Jesston Williams just said. So what's the healing mechanism here? I know it might be too early, or is it too early to talk about healing?
It's not too early, but what's going on now is probably the grief and the loss, and maybe even the shock, like what just happened. From what I've heard from some of the victims, they're kind of grateful that they're alive and that this could have been worse. So they're in their mind coming up with reasons and ways to manage this type of tragedy, this type of trauma. So yes, it is very early to see a lot of things. A lot of times things really plays itself out after the incident, and that could be months and even years after what they have experienced.
Yeah, and James, right, accomplished reporter, Washington Informer. You've been in this business a long time. You see this incident, as we just saw a video of what was going on there. James, how, as a journalist, how do you handle a situation like this as far as reporting the story? What's your responsibility?
Well, first of all, my responsibility is to report what has happened. I think it's important to understand the two things. Number one, that no one was killed, thank goodness. And number two, the gunman is still at large, which is troubling, very troubling. When you have incidents like this, and I go back to 9/11, I was in Washington at the time of 9/11, and you look at the people, the reaction of the people in New York, you become concerned, and you're thinking, is this going to trickle down to here in DC? And by the way, very quickly, there's going to be extra security on our metro today because of this incident.
Yeah, and Jesston, Angela Connolly, one of our viewers, always good to see Angela. She says that if you look at this individual's YouTube video talking about the suspect that James said is still at large, he is mentally unstable, Angela says. So apparently he's been putting some things on his personal social media pages that are unsettling. So when you're dealing with someone like that, and this is for both Jesston and Dr. Fredericks, Joanne Frederick, perhaps you could speak to the social media presence of individuals and how that might play a role in triggering something like this.
Go ahead, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm looking at it from a couple of perspectives. So from his perspective, obviously something is wrong and has been wrong mentally for a while. And the red flags were there, the things that he's posting, the things that he's saying. But then also from another perspective, other people that are reading this and feel similar or begin to get ideas, that's also another concern as it relates to mental health and how we deal with it.
Yeah, and Jesston, so we talk about the victims and folks who need that that assistance after such an incident, but now we're talking about the perpetrator perhaps having some mental health issues. That's he probably has encountered some trauma himself. Let's talk about dealing with the suspect. How do you how do you deal with the suspect here?
Well, I know there was a study done by the Stanford School of Medicine in 2021 where they researched mass shootings in the USA that happened from 1982 to 2019. This was 35 total. And of those suspects that survived and went to trial, they found that 28 of them, of the 35, had some type of mental disorder, mental disease, if you will, mental health issue. And, that's a huge number. That's a huge number. And we definitely want to find out what the root cause of that is. And when we talk about the victims, this country has gone through so many acts of trauma over the last couple years here, whether we're looking at the pandemic, whether we're looking at the war that's currently going on in Ukraine. This has had a huge impact on people. In fact, I saw somewhere where even though these mass shootings are 5%, 0.5% of homicides that happen here in the United States, 71% of adults suffer fear from that. And they get scared of places, going places in fear that this will happen to them. So you definitely have to identify the root cause and work from there. It's unfortunate. But I think it's very important for people to realize and come from a place of sympathy and empathy for those victims, and do things and put measures in place to at least try to prevent these type of mass shootings from continuing.
Yeah, and Dr. Fredericks, and I'll let James weigh in after you, Dr. Fredericks, but generally we see these acts of terrorists. We know, look, this is a terrorist act, no question about it, right? But this was an African American man. Is that an unusual crime for an African American?
I think it's unusual for us to see it on television, but I think it happens often throughout our communities. So yes, it's unusual to actually see that, right? And I wonder what people were thinking, like before there was a face, an identity. What are they on their mind? Well, who would do this? Who is this? And then when they see, who the suspect is possibly, what are the thoughts? What does that indicate for us?
Yeah, your neighbor, your classmate or workmate. Or James, I know you've covered these things. You mentioned 9/11. Certainly most journalists, if you were around for 9/11, you had a hand in writing something or covering something. But is this unusual, James? In your reporting, have you found it unusual that African Americans commit these types of mass acts of terrorism?
Well, like Dr. Frederick said, it has happened really throughout our history here in this country, but it is unusual because of the level of attention it has gotten recently. All of us on this show know that Black people just don't do things like that, just like Black people don't commit suicide, that sort of thing. The truth of the matter is that we do those type of things, and this is part of the discussion that we are finally having as a race in this country on mental health. Black people suffer from trauma. The trauma has come from slavery, among other things. And so until we deal with that, we're going to have to find ourselves wondering, is this an unusual crime for an African American? Which it is in the larger context, but it does happen in our community, Stacey.
Well, and James mentioned something there that we've been talking about throughout the pandemic. We African Americans have dealt with so much trauma. Dr. Frederick, I always put that S on the end, no S on the end. Dr. Frederick, talk about that a little bit, and about the trauma that African Americans have dealt with and continue to deal with.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So before we were African Americans, we were Africans, but we lost identity and culture a long way through, beginning with being captured and enslaved, and the issues that it takes to be captured and enslaved, including cutting off people's hair to take their power away, erasing language, religion, culture, and then bringing you to a place that you've never been heard of while separating us from family. So that's where a lot of the trauma began. But it continued with discrimination, racism, social injustices. And then within all of that, we have the intergenerational trauma. So those are the things that happens within families and people are trying to survive, right? So intergenerational trauma can also be poverty, teenage pregnancy, just a lot of things. So all of that is part of our history that relates to who we are today and the work that we need to do to be better and to cope with the discrimination, the racism. So we always have to cope, always, no matter what title we have, our race, our gender, our religion, our language. And the more we can cope, the better that we can survive these circumstances that I just described.
Yeah, the Black Press is going to continue to follow this horrible story out of New York City, the New York City subway shooting from yesterday. But we're going to stay on the topic of mental health because we're going to talk about Brittany Griner, seven-time WNBA All-Star, enters her 55th day in Russian custody. The WNBA Players Association has a new message amid concerns over her safety and her mental health, they said. The president of the WNBA Players Association spoke out yesterday for the first time on national television. She wanted to shine a new light on Brittany Griner's detainment and explain the overall mood among her fellow WNBA players. She said, "We move intentionally, and given the nature of Brittany's situation, it was very important for us to be intentional about doing the best thing to ensure that we don't compromise her coming home." She says a lot of that has to do with educating ourselves about the details of what was going on as much as we could know, but then understanding how important it was for us to be strategic about when and how we speak about her. She went on to talk about potential mental health issues as well. So this is really something. You talk about coping. Copeology is the name of the book Dr. Frederick has written, but she's in a foreign. She's not only in a foreign prison, and she's been there for 2 months or so, and there's no end in sight to her detainment. Dr. Frederick, update us a little bit, and obviously, again, I'll offer that disclaimer. I know you haven't treated Brittany Griner at all, but one's mental health. Not only is it a foreign prison, but there's a war going on. Can you kind of break down a little bit for us what she might be going through?
Well, the first thing I think about is the loneliness and the isolation, right? The loneliness wherever they have her locked up and her ability to connect with her loved ones, and the isolation just being alone. And so what are the things that goes through our mind when we're in that? Think about, for those who may not be able to relate, when we were on lockdown with COVID and you weren't allowed, what did that feel like for you? But you had the freedom to at least open your door and go somewhere. Imagine what that's like for her. Then she doesn't know exactly what's going on besides what she hears. And I feel for her, I feel, for her family, because this is not a good scenario, good situation. There is no, as you said, ending date. When does she come out? But even as I spoke about discrimination and racism, I wonder all of the isms that is going on, why she's there in the first place.
Yeah. And Mr. Williams, I'm coming to you on this because, and again, I'm getting way ahead of ourselves because according to state media in Russia, she could spend as much as 10 years there. Hopefully that's not the case, but coming home, let's just fast forward to hopefully she'll come home and hopefully that'll be soon. How does she recover? Jesse?
Yeah, well, what she's going to need once she gets home is all the love and support from her family, friends, and community. That's what she's going to need. She's going to have people that are going to be willing to support her. And also she's going to need good mentorship as well. Maybe a life coach or something along those lines so she'll have a full understanding of, making better decisions going forward. Now, I don't know all the details of the case. I just know, what I read online, and obviously that may be half the story. story, but bottom line, it's an unfortunate situation. When she gets home, she's going to need help and support, and have people in her corner that will speak life into her. Healing is going to be very necessary for her as well, because obviously she's experiencing a form of trauma. As you said, being over in a different country, you have the war going on, not knowing what's going to happen next. So that isolation, as Dr. Frederick mentioned, that fear, so she's definitely going to need lots of support, and also going to have someone in her corner to help her work on accountability and responsibility, because we definitely don't want to see the same mistake or similar mistakes happen going forward. So I just pray that once the smoke clears and she makes it through this situation, that she will then make better decisions for herself.
Yeah, and James, outside of the mental health issue, which we'll get back into in a moment, but this also speaks to, some people say it also speaks to something else. She was there because she was she plays basketball there in the WNBA off season, because quite frankly, WNBA doesn't pay a whole lot of money. They don't pay like the male athletes, and that's an issue, isn't it, James?
Yes, it is. It's been very much of an issue, not only for the WNBA, but also for women's soccer, professional soccer players, and to a lesser extent, because it's not nearly as developed, women football players. And so what we're looking at is the fact that she had, and she's not unusual, she has to go to another country in order to supplement her income, in order to continue to play the game that she loves, basketball. And now she's in a real pickle, because she's in a very strange country with a very strange system of government. And I suspect, Stacey, she's not in Moscow, which is sort of cosmopolitan and international. She may be in a rural Russian prison, which is doubly bad, because they're not used to seeing anybody that looks like her, a tall black woman who happens to be homosexual. So it's really a lot that she has to deal with. And I think the WNBA needs to continue its push, like the other women's sports, in order for pay equity in sports.
Yeah, and Dr. Frederick, I know that you can talk about this from even from your book standpoint, Copeology. I want you to do that if you don't mind.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks again. So Copeology, have it with me to show it to you right quick, is a book that I wrote along with some other contributors. And so the reason why I wrote the book is because as a mental health professional, I deal with people individually and privately and giving them tips, and I see them grow. And so my thought was, especially during the pandemic, what information can people get that's low cost or free, that's convenient for them to learn and grow and continue to cope. So some of the topics that we cover in this book, as it relates to both topics that we're covering today, is number one, I'll talk about survivor's guilt. We talk about a story of someone going through a tough situation, they survived, and the guilt. So that's kind of parallel to the people on the subway yesterday in Brooklyn, New York, where they're all survivors, right? But the guilt that comes with people who were able to escape harmlessly, and just the thought process that goes through that. So I give tips from a mental health perspective on how to survive things such as that. We give tips and stories about trauma, anxiety, loss, grief. And so as we talk about both of these stories, just for an example, loss for the subway shooting survivors, and even loss for Brittany, what is that like for them and even their family members? Because we are experiencing the loss as well. So, for example, Brittany, my understanding, has a wife. That's a loss for her. Even though she's alive, she's in another country, but what is the daily task for her, knowing that this relationship is not here right now in that way? And the same thing for the subway survivors. So I generalize a lot so that these incidents, as they continue, people can pick up different tools. Copeology is one, and use these tips and these stories to continue surviving, because we are survivors. We as people, we as African Americans, we're resilient, but we always need tools to continue going through these tragedies, unfortunately, but excelling at work, life, school, and with our families. Thus,
Yeah.
Copeology.
Wow. Well, we appreciate that very much. Just let David Youngblood, he says that we know what's going to happen. The war has to stop, and the negotiation for her release will drag on until Putin can get good PR. And, I have to agree with David Deere. Unfortunately, we have to agree with that because that's the way it seems to be going here. And I think this topic, too, final topic this morning, stays on the topic of mental health, if you will. Now President Joe Biden is now in his second year in office, yet supporters of former President Trump haven't given up their false claims that the 2020 election was stolen. And most important or most astonishing is that they haven't given up trying to overturn that election. Former Trump lawyer John Eastman took a trip to Wisconsin just a few weeks ago with a small group of Trump allies, where they secured a private meeting with the Republican leader of the Wisconsin State Assembly to decertify President Biden's victory. Eastman had previously drafted a plan for Trump to stay in power by falsely claiming that then Vice President Mike Pence had the power to reject legitimate electors during the 2020 election. They spent 2 hours behind closed doors, James, pressuring Republican Wisconsin Assembly Speaker Robin Vos to nullify the 2020 election and reclaim the electors awarded to Biden. That is a mental issue, isn't it? I mean, it's got to be. Come on, this is 2 years later.
You're absolutely right. They need to talk to Dr. Frederick or to Mr. Williams. These people have serious delusional problems. He lost the election. Donald Trump, it wasn't even close in terms of the popular vote. And he won Georgia and he won Arizona. And even though that was closer, he won those it was very clear he won both of those states. I don't know what's going on with these people. Something's not right with these folks.
Jesston, listen, talk about coping. These guys need some coping mechanisms, right?
Yeah, they absolutely do. They need all the tools they have at their disposal to move on and move past. Like the 2020 election has come and gone. We're looking at a new election coming up in a couple of years here. If they want their guy to run, get him up there, run again, and they'll do go from there. But just to keep going back and keep pounding this in regards to trying to overturn the votes. I mean, it's almost 2 years later. Yeah, it's almost to a point of insanity, right? Time to move on. Let's move on, people.
I mean, David Youngblood says white supremacy is a mental disease, but I mean, 2 years later, and they're still trying to decertify votes to overturn an election. I'm going to go back to Dr. Frederick.
Yeah.
What's up here with these folks?
It's definitely a mental issue, because here's the deal. It's about disappointment. They were disappointed that their person didn't win. It's about loss. They lost some of that power and that control, and it's grief. They're grieving that, and with that, they're not accepting the reality and the truth. So the issue is acceptance. The sooner we accept change and loss and disappointment, the better we can cope. But they're not accepting, so they're still getting in trouble. They're still losing their jobs. There's still a lot is still going on, but that's a problem, a mental health issue.
And that picture right there, anybody, will you please speak to it? I have no words. James?
I have never known the wife of a Supreme Court justice to get involved in politics like that. Most of them, because many of them are wealthy, deal with charity and cultural institutions, not political institutions.
Yeah. Angela Connolly says even some Black people are saying the election, the same thing, that the election was stolen. Again, you mentioned grief. Dr. Frederick's Frederick. But Jesston, grief. So help us to cope with this grief, Jesston.
Wow, she brings up a good point. There are a lot of Black people that believe that the election was stolen. I think that we're in a time of history where you have so much chaos and confusion going on, and a lot of times people want to, jump on the bandwagon or get to one side. Everybody obviously is open to have their own beliefs. But, the bottom line is it may have been stolen, but the bottom line is you got to look at the outcome, right? Trump did not win. Biden is in office. You can continue to rag on that and rag on that over and over again. But really, what good is that going to do? What good is that going to do? It's just not going to benefit anyone at that point. If Trump followers want Trump in office, well, sounds like they just need to do some things different, next time around if he decides to run again. But again, the chaos and confusion is out of control in this country. We're getting it from all aspects of life on every level. And, people just have to have the eyes to see and the ears to hear to make it through all the smoke, if you will. So
yeah. Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
So from a mental health perspective, if we look at the stages of grief, one of the stages, anger, where we lost something, there's been a change and we get upset. So we're looking at that anger and it just continues if I'm looking at the stages of grief. Another one is bargaining. We're looking at them trying to barter in all types of ways just because they are not accepting this grief and this loss. And I say they because, as the viewer wrote, that this could be white people or Black people or any other people. But if we look at it from a mental health perspective, this is what we're looking at.
Yeah, David Youngblood says the Black people have a striking affinity for that other ice water. And Angela Connolly says grief equals denial. Jesston Williams, I done said Jesston's name like 4 different ways this morning. I apologize. Jesston Williams, the executive director of Changelic, an organization that's geared toward helping people move on from traumatic experiences. Look him up, folks. Jesston knows what he's talking about. And Dr. Joanne Frederick, the DC-based licensed mental health counselor and author of the book, Copeology. We thank you so much for joining us this morning. Of course, James Wright of the Washington Informant, of course, our number one correspondent, James Wright. We appreciate all of you. Thanks for joining Let It Be Known. We'll see you tomorrow.